Oh, this is on. Cool. Hey, welcome to my quote-unquote talk about modern red team tools and tactics and techniques. There is a raffle with a mystery prize. If you click the link, you will see. And I hope you will enjoy. And yeah, give you guys a second to get onto that. But so just a bit of disclaimer. Obviously, this is like my own personal experiences and kind of knowledge of these things. I don't represent my company, whatever that may be, or the kind of views or whatever. If I think it works, it works. Don't go around and say anything else. And if it doesn't work in yours, then you have to try harder, really. Sorry. That's life in red teaming. So, without further ado, I think we will start. So, a bit about me. I've been in pen testing over 3-ish years now. I've been doing red teams for about 2 of those. I consider myself very newbie still and just very still learning the ropes, in my opinion. I've never really considered myself at any given point an expert, but it's kind of, I think that's kind of a good place to be. This is always changing. There's always new stuff happening in red teaming. There's always new tech being done, new 0 days, new attack paths, new technologies, new security and detection rules, new all kinds of stuff. And so having that kind of mindset that things are constantly changing beneath you is a good one to have. So without further ado, let's go explore. So, modern red team. What is a modern red team? Well, one I did recently is what I'm going to determine. So, to give you the scenario, a fake company called Fake Corp is asking for a red team. And they are a relatively large company, and their biggest concern is really not about their environment, but about like this new SaaS solution they have they want to roll out. It's only used by maybe a few devs and a few key members who need to use it, but the main point is that it's how they host their really sensitive internal information, and they're really worried about this coming out at any given point. And so that's the main objective of this red team is can you get to this kind of app and find data on it, right? So they've had pen tests before, but their SOC is brand new. So this is their first red team, more or less. And so in red teaming, there's like this trifecta, which I like to consider, which essentially is like basic security gaps and, and general like bad practices and just a bit of luck. And then, of course, you have like the perfect craft, which is nothing that is real. But keeping those 3 things in mind, I find kind of well encapsulate what like red team activities are. Like you'll see sometimes really easy stuff like domain admin share creds in a share, or like they have really strict inbound phishing rules, but enable content is there. So you can just ask them to enable content and then you'll get a payload. But in this case, the entire scenario will be without phishing. So it's a malicious employee or like post-compromise. So before we actually start, we use OSINT and stuff to get information about this company. Something I found really useful is just Stack Overflow. A lot of times devs and admins will just post information about stuff they're trying to get working with a full screenshot of their environment, internal domain names, app names, security policies. One time a dev had like a full screenshot of like his entire desktop on a guitar forum because he's trying to repair a guitar and he thought it'd be a good place to do it would be taking screenshots of stuff. It was very strange. But once we have OSINT and we kind of understand what we're going for, we need to build up our environment. So I can't stress this enough. Terraform and Ansible are the best things in modern red teams I can talk about. Getting that kind of inf spun up with a couple buttons and the configurations of a C2 and a C3 off the bat, it's so much easier than doing it manually. And it's so more reliable and dependable, being able to do it in like a quick few steps, some configuration, and then it's every time you can do it. So you can burn the domain really quickly if you need to, or you can pivot to a different kind of communication technique, or use something alternative like Slack or Twitter to kind of beacon initially, and all kinds of different things. And that kind of initial and like confidence in your inf that you can get set up, and lets you focus on the fun stuff of the kind of the engagement. So you're no longer wasting like a week on domain categorization and that stuff. You're just spending maybe half a day, and then you're ready for the test. So in general, what you try to do is you try and build guardrails. I find the more guardrails you build into stuff, and the more niche it is, the kind of the better returns. For those who don't know, guardrails essentially, before anything will run, it will check its local environment. And if it doesn't meet certain requirements, it just won't run. So something like the internal domain name or the machine name, if you want to be really careful, that kind of thing. Having those kind of built in means that someone can't just accidentally get your payload and then run it. Or that if a SOC is investigating and it's like guardrailed for the host, they run it on their own machine, it does something different than it's meant to do. And then that kind of control and that kind of obfuscation, I find gives a good reward in terms of like long-term stuff. But in reality, all this is kind of basic development, and it sounds really fancy. It's basic dev and IT architecture. The best resources I found on this are just like normal CentOS-based. Oh, you want to build Terraform for your actual environment. And then weaponizing that is only a really next step. So once we have, started the scenario, Our payload essentially will hijack Teams, I think, because the client would talk to us over Teams. So we knew they had Teams installed, and this was like a reliable kind of thing. And this kind of hijacking we find is, I think, is just fairly common now. So like all your common communication things like Teams, Slack, Discord, yada yada, all have like share the same kind of hijacking vulnerabilities where they look locally for a DLL to run before they look in the Windows folder. And so if you just place that DLL there, which you have write access to because they want to be able to allow people to install them without admin rights, you can just hijack them and run your code free will. So you get a reliable beacon there. And when they examine the process, it's all going through Teams. This application that's meant to be streaming content and like always in meetings and stuff. So it's a bit more Opsec than like running MS Build or just running, I don't know, the exe by itself. So in general, I've been using a lot of CoboStrike a lot. So it's kind of really been carrying me in these engagements, though I do experiment with other kind of C2s when I can. But a lot of the functionality CoboStrike, of course, the out-the-box stuff is really well known. But you can kit it out with like buffs, which are sort of beacon object files and stuff, so it runs in memory, or like aggressor scripts that add extra functionality. I have a few links to some useful ones I use there. But once I have this stuff, I'm able to go around and kind of fingerprint where I am, what they do. So I look at the kind of the processes running, what AVs, EDRs, GPOs they implement, what are there any gaps, any kind of exclusion zones that I can look into. And so I find a few things. So they're running like something like Cisco AMP, which you'll hook into every process and scan it as it runs. And it's very memory intensive, but it will pick up most things. But if you run things in like with block DLLs, for example, that will just bypass it. It won't be able to hook into that, which is, I think, is a pretty interesting gap. And so we do the kinds of, using that kind of thing, we will use like inline execute, which is like an aggressor script for CoboStrike that allows you to run, instead of a fork and run execution where it will spawn a process and then inject into that, it will just run the process in its own memory. And that kind of bypasses some AVs and EDRs. So we can do some like stuff. So we get like group policies, Active Directory enumeration, domain certificate enumeration using the certify tool by SpectreOps, which is relatively recent. And then just digging through shares. You'd be surprised what you find lying around, especially in big environments. So we have that. We've done some good old-fashioned recon, but we have nothing interesting. Our user is brand new. They were made for this engagement. They have no cool rights. They have nothing interesting and no access. But by default, they have this share lying around, which is just on a SQL server, and it has a backup of the SQL server that runs every few months, apparently. So it's small. A few of them, one of them is small enough to just exfiltrate and then restore offline using a bit of MS SQL on a VM. And then from that, you can pull the SA hash and crack that. And using just the general word list or the name of the instance and stuff, you can crack them fairly reliably. And at that point onwards, it's just kind of CMD, XP CMD shell. So you can just run, using a tool called PowerUp you could run remote SQL queries against it. And since you have the SA account, you're able to run OS commands that way. And so using that, we're able to laterally move from our initial access machine onto the server. So, and that as system rights, because the server is misconfigured, that it has more permissions than it needs. So now we're running a system, which is great. And using some certification stuff, we find that domain computers can go from just domain computers into domain controllers using certificate templates. You can use that tool to essentially privask further to domain admin. Awesome, but it's not enough. Our main objective wasn't privask, it was compromising the SaaS solution. So we need to look elsewhere. So, to chase this objective, to kind of summarize the summary, what we did, so we had the user, using DC Sync, we got the credits for the developer user Alice, and we hung around to see when any of the devs came online and had a session. So we ran a tool called Bloodhound to look for sessions. The user Bob came online, and so using Alice's creds, we logged into her email account and sent him an email saying, "Hey Bob, I'm having problems accessing this SaaS solution. Could you please log on for me and see if you're having the same issues?" Bob, obviously unaware that we have a beacon running on his machine, happily obliges, logs onto the thing, and emails Alice saying, "Yep, I can log in, no worries, here's a screenshot." And so we dump sessions, Google Chrome sessions, those cookies and stuff, from his browser, and use those to essentially hijack his session and access the application, giving us access to all the juicy, internal confidential data and achieving our objective. So easy. And with that, we had finished the main flag for the engagement. So obviously, the client is happy. We've proved where they're vulnerable and shown issues they've done. They come back with some detections. The session dumping was a bit loud. They thought there was a miscommunication. Someone in the SOC thought it was a pen test, so he didn't escalate until later he realized it wasn't, at which point it was a bit too late. And so obviously that kind of thing was not great for me. I thought I could have done it better, could have been more Opsec. I don't know if anyone else had to dump sessions without doing that, but I'd be interested. The blue team saw some other activity, but I won't go into detail because of time. But we also use things like run DLL, which is a Windows executable to run payloads, which is not ideal. It's a known way to run bad files. And so now these days I'd use something like MSI-exec or MSHDA or something a bit more niche, but open to suggestions. And in general, I'm aware that if I had no access to that initial share, that first step, this would have been a very different process. So like, how would I have done the other things? They're happy with this, but obviously there's one issue, there's always dozens more you don't see. And that's kind of a limitation of red teams. But that is what it is. So are there any questions? Yes? What do you mean by deception technology? So I wouldn't really spray credentials much on an endpoint, especially in a red team initially, at that point, because it would be fairly noisy. I would imagine all those login events would raise a flag. In terms of bypassing that, if I had to, I would maybe run like one per day kind of thing. I'd do some creds and I'd pick like a bit and I'd spray that and stop and do nothing else for the rest of the day. And just kind of like by spacing out your activity, you blend in a lot more with normal stuff, I think, and that would be kind of the best way to evade that kind of stuff. I have like a minute left. Is there anything else? Oh, less? Yeah? I mean, automated... So the question here is, how do I feel about automated red teaming as a manual red teamer? I don't know. It'd be cool to get automated out of a job. But other than that, I think an issue with automated stuff, it looks for the known. So a lot of the things is AD audit is not a red team. I think a lot of these tools will focus on these kind of low-hanging fruits and not really think about the wider picture. Things like maybe not stuff in shares, but like maybe combining different issues together to chain things. I find that difficult to think. And then especially obviously with social engineering, internal phishing, I think these kind of tools will struggle with that kind of internal aspect. Like we picked Bob in this scenario because Bob and Alice talked a lot. And they had a certain way of talking, so by copying that, Bob was none the wiser. But an automated tool would kind of struggle with that kind of connection. Anything else? All right, cool. I guess that's me done. Yeah.